All right, hello everybody. Just give a minute for people to file in and get their audio set up here. And then I'm just going to cover a quick technical instruction on how to interact with the panelists before I hand it off to the moderator. All right, so while people are still filing in, I just want to take a quick moment to welcome everyone and thank you for taking the time out of your day. To start things off, this is a Zoom webinar, not normal Zoom meetings, so you don't have to worry about your camera or microphone being enabled. You are muted and unseeable by default, so you don't have to worry about people seeing you in your pajamas or anything like that. But to interact, there's two methods primarily. There's the chat function. You can either address all attendees by selecting the all panelists and attendees in the drop-down by the to area there, and that will address everybody. We ask that you reserve the use of the chat function for commentary or side discussion or any technical issues you have. If you have a question that you would like the panelists to answer, please use the Q&A function. It'll make it much easier for us to manage what's been asked and what's been answered already, and as well as letting everybody else see your question and add their own comments or even upvote it. So without further ado, I want to hand it off to Melanie Gottlieb.
Thank you, Michael. Good afternoon. I'm Melanie Gottlieb, Deputy Director of ACRO, and I'd like to welcome you to today's ACRO Coffee Break. It's a pleasure to be on the line with all of you today as we navigate the challenges presented by COVID-19 and the crisis together. I want to especially thank today's panel for giving time to ACRO during this time of crisis. With me today, I have Kimberly Buster Williams, Vice President for Enrollment Management at the University of Mary Washington, Virginia. Jody Gordon, former Vice President, Students and Enrollment Management in British Columbia. Stanley Henderson, Vice Chancellor for Student Life and Enrollment Management, retired from the University of Michigan Dearborn and former President of ACRO, as well as our own Tom Green, Associate Executive Director for Consulting in SEM. As always, we're hopeful that our technology will not fail us. This is a large Zoom call with a number of panelists, all working at the mercies of our home Wi-Fis. With so many of you on the call, we know that we may not be able to answer all of your questions during the Q&A at the end, but rest assured they will be collected and added to the ever-growing list of policy questions that our guidance team is working through every day. And it may resurface as an article in our Connect newsletter, a specific guidance document, or another coffee break. Next slide, Michael. As you navigate the challenges in this crisis, your association is here to connect you with network colleagues to work through together in this time of unprecedented disruption in our profession. We've opened up our content vaults to the higher education community through our free 3-month membership option. If your membership is lapsed, or if there are others on campus you want to have access to our resources to support you through this transition, we hope that you will consider this option. Next slide. Related to today's topic, you can find in the bookstore ACRO's Basic Guide to Enrollment Management. The guide has practical applications of SEM best practices, tips on how an institution can change and consequently gauge its successes, and techniques to aid the enrollment manager, director of admissions, student service director, or anyone in a management position through the enrollment planning at their institution. This is available now in the ACRO bookstore. ACRO's work diligently to provide specific guidance to institutions as they navigate decision-making on their campuses to adapt and serve their students. To build our guidance, we're using established ACRO standards and guidance and re-envisioning them through the lens of the current COVID-19 crisis, and then consulting with subject matter experts from our board of directors and amongst the membership and across higher education. Who is the guidance team? Executive Director Mike Riley, myself, Associate Executive Directors Tom Green and Tina Deneen, and Director of Research Wendy Kilgore, all former campus-based professionals with years of experience, along with Director of Government Relations William Gill. While this is not the way that ACRO typically releases new guidance, We're balancing our processes of member development with the need to address the current crisis with something immediate to support you as you navigate this new normal. We want to give you guidance that is thoughtful and well-developed, yet timely. If you have suggestions for the guidance team to consider, please don't hesitate to contact us through the contact form at acro.org/COVID guidance. Next slide. I'd like to turn it over to Tom now, who will talk about the agenda.
Thank you, Melanie. So pleased to be with everyone today and to have this opportunity to talk about a very hot topic, which is the situation we find ourselves in and really a crisis of enrollment looming in the midst of this pandemic. Unlike anything we've ever seen before, perhaps similar in some ways to the past, but also totally new, and really throwing us into an area where we're searching for answers and guidance. And I'm so pleased to have the other panelists with me here today and to learn from and share their years of experience and insights in this really trying time. We're going to approach today's webinar by introducing a topic. And so we'll advance a slide, a topic will come up. And then I'll ask one of the panelists to begin with a response to that. And then we'll have other panelists who will also share their comments on those topics. And we'll move on to the next topic. What I'd like to ask the audience to do during that time is, as you think of questions or comments that you may have regarding that topic, as Michael Sisson noted before, use that Q&A section and post that right there. And during our sessions today, during these topics, Melanie Gottlieb will be monitoring those and kind of coalescing some topics, some questions, some things to talk about, because we're going to allow some significant Q&A time during this session for you after we get through these topical areas. Okay, so given that, let's move to the next slide, please. Here we are in the midst of an enrollment crisis, and fast action is needed, and we've had to move very, very quickly to adapt to a public safety, public health crisis. In the midst of that, though, we need to be thinking about our long-term outcomes and the consequences of these actions that we're taking in such a rapid fashion. So why is that strategic long-term thinking important now? I'd like to ask Stan Henderson if he'd begin with the first response today.
Thanks, Tom, and hello, everyone. It's good to have you in your sheltered in place positions, as I am here in Michigan. And I'm reminded as we start this conversation of what a colleague said to me a few days ago, that if anything is happening more than 6 hours out, that's long-range planning. And I think that many of us are in a position to be thinking we just have to act. We don't really have time for long-term strategic planning and thinking because we have to be responding to what's right there in front of our noses. And that's true. I think we have to have a lot of empathy for everyone who is at an institution and trying to react remotely to this kind of situation. But there's a tendency when we get into that kind of operational situation, I think, for us to sort of be chasing squirrels. Oh, we got to do this. Oh, we have to do this. Got to think about this right now. And I can't think about, I got to do this. And that squirrel chasing, being distracted by the shiny objects in front of us, really is going to bog us down. So we have to come back and really think as a framework about enterprise thinking. Enterprise thinking is really big picture, the big tent. And that's what strategic enrollment management planning and thinking can do for us in this kind of a crisis. It's a way of almost calming people so that they're more able to react in a calm and foresightful kind of way. You have to be purposeful. You have to really be institutionally focused, data-driven, collaborative, and in this situation, above all, adaptive. I've decided my new first principle is one adapts. And that really is strategic planning. It's thinking about what we have to do without being rigid. Can't be rigid. We have to be able to stage the rollout of our actions. We have to be able to think by looking at the environment around us, both internally and externally. To me, that's the story. That's the reason why, even in crisis, we have to reach out and grab a hold of strategic long-term planning, particularly for enrollment as we face the COVID-19 crisis.
Excellent, Stan. I wanted to ask Jody and Kimberly if they had any additional thoughts on this topic.
Sure, Tom. I'll just add to Stan's important points there that I think if we take the time to remind ourselves of who we aspire to be as an institution, and then reflect on what has happened in this new order that still very much meshes with who we aspire to be as an institution. And when we are able to then connect those two, I think we have the opportunity to think long-term, make the necessary adjustments that we want to make, but yet still grounded in who we are. Our values, our mission, our vision as an institution is still core to that strategic conversation.
That's excellent, Jody, and it takes us back into those principles of SEM and thinking about that. Kimberly, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, I think certainly there is a sense of urgency, but I think that at the same time, I think as institutions, we really need to live our brands and to stay focused and to not become so distracted that we really lose sight of some of the longer term plans and the focus we really have to have, again, on looking more long term.
Thank you. I was thinking of the specific example around perhaps the desire at this point to look at financial incentives, additional forms of aid for students as they are thinking about attending our institutions this fall. And we're worried, right, that we might not have enough students to be viable or to be healthy in this fall. And so certainly financial aid, institutional aid incentives have been one way that people have influenced enrollment behavior, tried to encourage enrollment behaviors from students. And as we do those, really important to think strategically, because if we're successful at that and students do attend, then of course we're going to be living with that decision for many years to come afterwards. And we need to be, of course, doing everything we think we reasonably can at this point, but we need to make sure we're still paying attention to some of those long-term issues like discount rates. How are our relationships with our secondary schools? If we change any of our admissions patterns, are we signaling things that we haven't signaled before to our secondary guidance counselors or our community college guidance personnel? So those are things to really make sure that we're keeping in the front of our mind as we're trying to make these rapid decisions and take actions that will help us get to where we need to be, wherever that may be this fall, get to where we need to be this fall. Okay, very good. Excellent. So I want to turn to the next topic here. And you know, what have we learned in the last 4 to 6 weeks? It seems almost unbelievable that this has only been this amount of time. It seems like forever in some ways. And then how is that similar or different perhaps than what we may have seen in the past? And I'd like to ask Kimberly to please take the first response on this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I mean, we certainly have learned a lot over the last few weeks. And I think the thing that stands out to me is just the need for flexibility. And then I think also for teams to be really as innovative and creative as possible. At the University of Mary Washington, as an example, since the crisis, we've hosted 54 webinars via Slate, which is our CRM. And in the beginning of the cycle, I really anticipated that we would host 10 to 15. And so, certainly there was an early recognition that we were going to have to pivot and really do a little bit more with this particular strategy than we even imagined. And so those webinars have been recorded. We've invited faculty and folks from across campus. And so we really recognized early on that we were going to have to make some drastic changes in terms of some of our yield strategies. And that's just one example. Another thing that I think I've learned, we're pretty data driven at Mary Washington. And so I think I also realized that our predictive models were certainly not going to be as helpful as they've been in the past. And so, that was just a reality. And once I realized that, certainly that was another opportunity and a place where really we needed to pivot, to not have so much discussion that pertained to those predictive models, because for this cycle, they're not going to be quite as helpful as they've been in the past. I think what's different about this is typically I provide some scenarios in terms of our enrollment. And one thing that I did at the beginning of this crisis is I shared with my president 3 scenarios. And one scenario was really a worst case scenario, but I was very honest with him in terms of the fact that that scenario was very possible. And so I love the saying, gritty faith, but also gritty facts. And so really being honest and really taking a look at some of those scenarios for planning purposes, I felt was really, really critical. So those are some of the things that I've learned. And I think this is very different. And I think it's May 1 and the summer is going to change a lot for universities over the summer. There's still quite a bit of work that remains.
Kimberly, that's great. I want to first ask Jody and Stan for any additional thoughts or comments about this, especially as we think about those trends we may have seen, right? This is not the first time we've had an enrollment crisis. It may be a unique one, but we've had other enrollment crises over the last few decades. How is this similar or different from those?
Well, Tom, I would say from the perspective, and I guess I'll take the age advantage here. From the perspective of 50 years in higher education that I have had, there's been nothing like this. The only thing that even approaches it is the Kent State shootings almost 50 years ago to the day in 1970 during the Vietnam War. And universities, many universities shut down at that point, just simply sent students home. The grades that they had were the grades that they got. There was no way to go online because there was no online. So this is something that is so incredibly different, which just gives me such admiration for all of the participants that are sitting out there on the coffee break today, having to deal with something that we simply have not dealt with before. But I do think that one of the lessons from that is that in adjusting and adapting, I know that you have found things that you're not doing that you were doing before. And the Carillon Tower Foundation is not cracked as a result of your not doing those things. And it gives you the opportunity to ask the question, do we need to do that when we get back to normal or near normal? It's a way of thinking about strategically changing what we do and streamlining and the ability to take folks who are doing jobs that maybe we don't need to do anymore and repurpose them in other positions. To me, that's one of the things that we can take as someone said one time, they like silver linings. And one of the possible silver linings here to me is that we can learn things from something that's so totally different than we've ever dealt with before to make positive changes going forward.
Excellent. Jody.
Not a whole lot to add to, I think, what has been a very good summary of we've learned over the last few weeks, and an accelerated pace for sure. The one thing I'll add maybe perhaps is a positive note that I think is similar to other crises. And I think what we've noted is that our assets are still of great value. The knowledge, skills, and abilities of our staff, our faculty, our students are needed in our communities and have been certainly drawn upon. Even just seeing folks doing the amount of research that they've pivoted and switched to in order to support what's happening in the world, and the medical equipment that's been donated to support. The generosity and the outreach from our campuses has been just tremendous, and even using our residents as warming stations for those in need. And so I think that's the one similarity I see in a crisis, is that we as a community of post-secondary are very important in supporting our surrounding communities. And I applaud all of you for the efforts that you've put towards that.
It's great, Jody, and it leads me to something I'd written down here as a note, and I saw that Clayton Smith, who's one of he's our SEM conference director and faculty member at the University of Windsor, also up in Canada, sent me an article this week, and I really enjoyed it. It was about what happened during the plague and during smallpox, because remember, universities were around at that time in Europe. And so it reminded us that this is not the first time we may have seen a pandemic. Certainly, I mean, in the modern era, it's unprecedented. But one of the things that came from that was this appreciation of science. And so really, I think that the value of the nerd has gone way up over the last few weeks. And we're really looking to universities to be able to help us, and researchers be able to help us. And we're seeing the amazing things, the vaccine that's being developed at Oxford, the rapid response of Johns Hopkins, the University of Washington doing trials. We're really seeing colleges and universities stepping to the forefront here in the ability to do great science and help us in this. One of the things that I've seen, I think that's been very striking to me over the last few weeks, has been the concept of what is now risky. And I think about that from the standpoint of risky jobs. What kind of job did you have that was very risky all of a sudden? Being a server in a restaurant, driving a taxi, working in public transit. These became risky jobs. We still have risky jobs in meat processing plants today. And so those became very risky jobs, and all of a sudden an incredibly deep appreciation for what I would consider as a safe job that I have. Somebody is paying me a paycheck to be working from home right now. And I think there's an immense feeling of gratitude and safety of having a job that, that allows you to do that. And I see one of these things that will come out of this will be an interest in having a sense of safety about work and safety of the job. And I think that's something to look for as we come out of this, in thinking about what will this drive? What will be the things that will be driven toward education and through education as we move forward? Michael, would you please, let's move to the next one, because this is a really interesting one, in that why we see such a crisis for higher education is that social distancing is really threatening the very fabric of how we've considered at least in-person education to operate. And that is, we highly value student engagement, that personal connection we want people to feel between other students, between faculty, with the traditions and the community of the institution. This is really saying, well, you can't be together, right? You can't do those things in the same way you did before. So what then is the value proposition of community in a time of pandemic? How do we talk about the value of community in higher education during this crisis? I want to ask Jody to start with the first answer on this one.
Thanks, Tom. And I think to start with, we would turn to what's happened around the world. We can think of really wonderful examples of creating a sense of community, with those in Italy standing on their balconies singing collectively, and many of us every night at 7 p.m. standing at our windows or on our balconies cheering out to those who are working so hard to keep the rest of us safe. That's a sense of community that never existed before. So we can do this. We can create opportunity where it didn't exist. But I think it begins with thinking about that sense of community for your faculty and for your staff first. If they feel disconnected, isolated and alone, then obviously their ability to create a sense of community for your students will be much more difficult. So we start there. How are we going to create a sense of community then for our faculty and staff, and reaching out and making sure that they are connected in order for them to then also reach out and connect our students. Technology is wonderful for this. Our students, many of them are comfortable with this. Even our international students in surveys are saying that they're fine with being connected as groups through things like Zoom and Microsoft Teams, using Instagram and YouTube. We're seeing teaching done in a variety of different platforms in order to be able to support students. The other key, though, is the peer-to-peer. We must create opportunities for our students to be able to connect with each other. And the amazing thing about doing that virtually is you're not restricted by time and space. You don't have to book a room for the students to come. You'd have to book something virtually, and it can be done at any time zone, anywhere from anywhere in the world, provided that they have access to Wi-Fi. And that's where we've also seen schools be incredibly creative and putting Wi-Fi routers in school buses and driving them around their communities because they're threatened by lack of Wi-Fi access to support their students. I would say, though, remember, and I take this from a wonderful article written by a colleague up here in Canada at the Southern Alberta Institute of Technology. Remember the EDI, the equity, diversity, inclusion, when you think about creating community, that there already are students that are going to feel even further isolated. And how do we make sure that we think about that EDI when we think community?
Great. Thank you, Jody. Stan, I wanted to ask if you might also add some response here.
Well, I have been someone over the years who has talked about the fact that there are institutions of higher education and communities of higher education. And as I like to say, in an institution of higher education, things happen to you. It's a passive kind of place. In a community, you're a member, a participant, expected to contribute. And that's a kind of tone and expectation setting opportunity that universities and colleges have for their students, that you should approach your educational endeavor not in an isolated way, but in a contributing and participatory way. And for me, the COVID-19 crisis is an opportunity to enlarge on that, partly because students are so much more digitally oriented, and we sometimes worry that students really would rather be on their devices than interacting face-to-face with people. But we can't lose sight of the fact that they need to be engaged. They need to be a part of a community, because for some students, particularly those that might be at risk, such as first-gen students, students of color, Pell-eligible students, research shows that those are students that might become isolated, and if they're isolated, they might withdraw and they might disappear. So we really have to use their inclination to be digitally engaged, to engage them with the community of the university or the college. And there are some really great ways, I think, of doing that. Listening to Kimberly talking about how many Zoom kinds of meetings they'd had engaging students who were thinking about coming to Mary Washington, that's one of the ways that you do that. Fredonia, SUNY Fredonia is doing some great things of providing timelines to faculty and staff for reaching out to students online at particular times. So for example, they might be asking faculty and staff to reaffirm that sense of belonging, of being a participant and a contributor at one point. And then at another point, they might be communicating to identify proactive activities, resources that could help students, finishing strong as the semester comes to the end, and acknowledging achievements. Those kinds of outreach and building community virtually is a way of actually bringing students in. And one way of looking at that is that students are already acclimated to that. And I think that they're responding very positively to it. It is a way of affirming the importance of community, as well as using engagement as part of the process of seeing value and why students are here. If they don't see value for the time and the energy, the effort they're putting into what they're doing, they're not going to stay. So the more that they're engaged, the more they're likely to see value and to stay, and learning happens as a result of that, and the community is strengthened at the same time.
Oh, thank you, Stan. Kimberly, can you speak to this a little bit? Stan just mentioned, of course, some of the things you're already doing at Mary Washington University, but can you talk just a little bit about the value of community and how that value proposition comes across to students at this time?
Right. No, I'm happy to share. I think part of, I think what's also happened ironically is I think people have recognized that there are things that we take for granted, and so I think this has also forced everyone to really look at things through a different lens, and things that they perhaps in the past have taken for granted. One thing that we've been working collaboratively in Mary Washington is really the onboarding and orientation. And so, of course, for our current students, they're anxious to return. And so one thing we've noticed is that, for example, our registration numbers are up for fall. And again, we really attribute this to the fact that students they're anxious, they miss their friends, they miss campus. And so I do think there is just some excitement, and folks are really anxious to come back to campus when that will be hopefully for us in the fall. In terms of orientation and onboarding new students, again, this crisis is really forcing us to think strategically about how we will do this in a way that we can really showcase Mary Washington and really build community among the incoming students, which is, again, going to be a little different because we typically do that on a face-to-face fashion over the summer months. And so, again, we've really thought about and have really been working towards how we can replicate this, how we can really build that sense of community for our incoming freshmen. And we have several things that we're looking at in terms of some of the online activities that they'll do, but we certainly know that onboarding for those incoming freshmen is so critical. And I've really been pleased as colleagues in our orientation department, our admissions teams have really put their heads together to think about how can we do this? How can we really bring about this community over these next few summer months so that students won't miss out on that, and they will come to Mary Washington feeling as connected as they would have had they done that in a face-to-face session.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Kimberly. Michael, can you move on?
Tom,
Yes.
if I could, I see that Susan has made a comment over here about the fact that some students have more trouble with technology than we understand. And I think that's a really good point that's worth mentioning right now. It is sometimes the case that adults who are returning might not be as adept as the digital natives, the Gen Z students might be. And to me, what that suggests is that in a time of forced online and social distancing, it just means we have to double down more to help those students, maybe by working to provide opportunities for Zoom chats coming together, to have like coffee breaks for students that faculty might develop, or those kinds of programs that clubs might have could be done through Zoom as well. The notion of engaging in the classroom with the information is important, but the notion of engaging outside of the classroom is also important. And to Susan's point, we cannot fail to understand that there are different levels of facility with technology, and there are going to be different reactions to being socially distanced. And we have to be always thinking about those and having a whole panoply of things that we're going to deploy to help students become engaged and feel like they're part of a community.
Great. Thank you. Great point, Stan. And thank you for responding to that comment. Now, this nice segue into this, right? That there were several enrollment trends occurring before this happened. There were things that were happening we were very concerned about, and opportunities that we were very interested in taking advantage of prior to this. So as we think about this rather seismic disruption, what things might be accelerating as a result of this, of the disruption? So Stan, I'm going to ask you to take that one first, and talk just a little bit about some of the things that you've seen.
I would say first, Tom, that accelerate is the operative word there. I was talking to a colleague a couple of weeks ago and putting COVID-19 in terms of being the great disruptor of what it was going to do to higher education. And his comment, very perceptive, was, I'm not sure that COVID-19 isn't doing more to accelerate things that were already happening than what it is to disrupt as a complete break kind of thing. I was really struck by that. And one of the things that I think that fits so well is the concept of online instruction. If you think about what's been happening with online instruction over the last few years, it really has been there. When you see flagship institutions that are offering master's degree programs all online in things like nursing, that's a real signal that that's out there in higher education, and it's been happening. I think what COVID-19 is doing with things like online instruction is accelerating it. I'm seeing colleges and universities that are saying to faculty, when we come back to campus, we will be assigning faculty to face-to-face classes, but you'll also be expected to be doing online classes as well. It'll become part of your regular assignment. If you have 2 classes that are face-to-face, you'll have 1 class that is online. I think that's an acceleration that is of something that's actually been moving to. What COVID-19 has done is sort of swept away the last great resistance among faculty who have held on to the sage on the stage way of interacting with students. And online is just going to be a part of what we do. I think another thing that is being accelerated by what we've been doing the last 6 weeks is streamlining a process. The idea of how many people have to sign off before a student can drop a class, whether it's online signature or regular signature, that's probably going to be accelerated. That kind of streamlining has been happening for a number of years, but I think COVID-19 is accelerating that kind of streamlining. I think it's also going to be streamlining the notion of not necessarily job sharing, but the ability to move from one job to another. So if you have been doing something in an administrative operational office that is totally transactional, and the transaction now moves to being completely automated, your position might be transitioned to being more interaction rather than transaction. That's the kind of thing we've been seeing as well. I'm thinking about advising and the notion of advising moving from transactional, helping people schedule, to being more something that you're going to be intrusive with the student, more holistic. That's been happening. I think that COVID-19 is accelerating that move from transactional advising to holistic or intrusive advising, just because it's necessary to have those kinds of things, and we see it more and have become more, I guess, almost more comfortable with it because the situation has required that we adapt.
Stan, thanks. I want to approach this maybe in from this agreeing with you, and also perhaps to look at it in a different way. I think we're all accelerating our learning of what quality online means. I think our faculty are learning how to become online faculty and what really good teaching online will look like. I think that's going to accelerate rapidly, and I think that's real benefit and opportunity. And to your point, we're all learning how to do things online and remotely, like process transcripts, for example, or do evaluation of transfer credit in ways that perhaps we were reticent to do in the past or weren't doing efficiently enough. And now we've been kind of thrown. So we're all learning how to do that. I wanted to add that I was on a call earlier this week with some state policy folks and online technical education, because a lot of technical programs have really been about face-to-face, hands-on type of learning, advanced manufacturing, welding, et cetera, those type of things. And we may see some things emerging from this in new ways and very creative ways of being able to engage the folks out there who need a high quality credential in technical education. And then I wanted to also just highlight too, you know, kind of maybe an elephant in the room, that we'll have probably some accelerated financial instability in the higher education space. We know institutions took some very big financial hits this spring in doing some refunds. They have lost a lot of revenue. They're likely to lose revenue this summer, if not this fall. And as we saw in the past, when we've had these massive hits in our economy, it has an impact on state tax revenues, which has an impact then on higher education support. And so we'll likely see both public and private institutions really hurting for revenue. So we'll likely see some acceleration of the financial instability that was already happening in the sector. Before we move on to the next one, I just wanted to ask, Kimberly, you and I were visiting earlier this week, and you had this really great response to this topic, which was there are things that are probably going to decelerate, not accelerate. So can you talk just a minute about those?
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Yes, I do think that some things may decelerate. For example, I think students that in the past have typically looked to out of state, and there are of course states that really do have large percentages of students who actually leave the state to go to college. I do think that families and students are going to start to revisit that, and I do think that could possibly decelerate in terms of those actual mobility rates and how students are thinking about out of state as a choice. The other thing that I think may decelerate, and we're seeing it a little bit at Mary Washington, just the number of students that are double and triple depositing. You know, that's been a trend for some time. But with the economic crisis that we have and some of the uncertainty with families, I do think that is something that could easily decelerate. Students being a little bit more strategic and a little bit more definitive with their decision, and once they've made a decision, perhaps not making multiple deposits and really being mindful of their families' budgets.
Great, thank you, Kimberly, so much. I think in the interest of time, I don't want to preclude that Jody might not have a response to this, but maybe flip to the next one and we'll do a twofer on this one and ask Jody to give the first response, either as an additional comment on our last point or the first comment on this. There's a lot of concern over international student enrollment, and I've done the 1L, 2L here because obviously we have some different things that are going on in the US and Canada. Since 2016, the US has seen a sharp downturn because of our policy on international visitors and students. But Canada's seen a big upswing, and a lot of the enrollment growth in Canada has come from international students in the last few years. So let's talk first about the prospects for that in Canada, and then maybe talk a little bit about it in the United States. Jody, please.
Thank you, Tom. And yes, accelerate and decelerate is perfect here. So good segue from the previous question. And just of note, we have seen increases here in Canada of international students over the last decade. Some of our schools see only about 4 to 6% international, but we have some colleges and universities that are as high as 40 to 50%. And so the big question right now is, will we see government legislation in Canada that will allow distributed learning, online learning as permissible under study abroad rules. And part of that is because a lot of schools in Canada are saying that fully in-person may not occur until January of next year. So that question is certainly of a big concern. What we're hearing from prospects, there was a survey released this week of Canadian prospective students applying to Canadian colleges and universities, international students. About 13,000 of them responded to the survey. And what we're hearing is about 30% already are living in Canada. We have high schools where international students are also drawn, and so they're already here. And so obviously connecting with those students who may be already your prospects, easier than obviously dealing with students outside of the country. But 55% of those that responded said that they had received an offer. So there's a lot of international students that are still waiting on offers, many of which I think have been delayed due to other issues that we're dealing with at our institution. But those students are also indicating that they would prefer to come to Canada, but want to make sure that it's going to be for in-person instruction. And so if that's not till January, how are we going to fill the gap then in the fall term? And so some schools are looking at, well, it may be theory online for part and then in person for the other if we can be up and running sooner than January. So we're seeing a lot of discussion around communicating with those individuals. Agents are used quite a lot in Canada by schools. The agents are reporting on that survey as well that they're pleased with the level of communication, but the international students are reporting that they feel that they need more information. And so one of the cautionary notes is that if you are communicating with your agents, while we're doing well in Canada in that connection, the information needs to flow through, I think, better towards the prospective students that are looking to also come to Canada to study. I'll pause there to give my colleagues a chance, obviously, to talk a little bit about the situation in the US.
You know, Jody, that was such a great point about students wanting to come and do it if it's going to be face-to-face. Because I think that seems so universal with all of our students that they really value this face-to-face instruction, and the online instruction, at least to this point that they've received, has not thrilled them about the prospect of coming back in the fall for more of that. I think in the US, I'll just comment briefly because I know we have some really good questions sitting out there we want to get to. That probably the biggest bottleneck we're seeing is that the consular offices across the world are not open for visa appointments. And so even if a student is admitted already for the fall, the opportunity to get an appointment for that visa interview to get the F1 or the J1 is going to be very difficult and very late. And so there's a big backlog, and that'll have to be worked through. So, my counsel to people is if they're not already here, you're probably not going to see them coming across the border from anywhere to be able to come here this fall. It is, though, as you said, there are a lot of students already within the borders. Either they're transfer students, there are so many at community colleges these days, or there are many, growing trend has been students from other countries coming to high school here. And so there are international students that are here, but they're not, as we think of them, really coming from those large countries directly and enrolling here in the United States. Great. We could go on for so much longer, but I really want to make sure we have a chance to get to our questions. And Melanie, I know you've been collecting those and looking through those. And so maybe if you could let us know what our first question would be.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tom. This is a great discussion from all of our panelists. There's one follow-up question actually for Kimberly. When you pivoted away from your predictive models, what did you do instead to guide discussions and decisions and actions at your institution? And so maybe start with Kimberly, but if someone else has another question, another answer, feel free.
That's a great question. I think, one of the things we still have our predictive models, but really we're just trying to, and at this point we're trying to just kind of weigh the predictive model with some of the information we have from the counselors and the recruiters on boots on the street. And so really just trying to kind of not just rely on that quantitative data that model typically presents, but really folding in some of the qualitative, really hearing from our recruiters, hearing from some of our deans and chairs as they're making phone calls and outreach to students. And so really kind of balancing both of those things. And so kind of enhancing the model to include a little bit more of actually what we're seeing and hearing in real time.
Oh, that's a great response, Kimberly. And I will add to that just a little bit of thinking of going back to kind of our standard or seasoned ways of looking at this, is that we're always looking for tangible signs that students are really coming. What actions have they taken in order to do this? And there are yet actions to be taken between now and fall that will help us track the kind of the firmness, if you will, of these numbers, such as signing up for orientation. If there are yet housing deposits to be paid, are they paying those housing deposits? Have they filed that FAFSA? Have they taken some of those steps as we get in the summertime? Have they done their master promissory notes for loans? Those will all be indications that of where we're headed for this fall, or to help firm up those numbers. Any of our other panelists want to respond to the one on predictive models, or shall we move on to the next one? Okay, Melanie, what's our next question?
Question from Tammy Agard. How do we communicate the appropriate level of concern to our students without operating from a position of fear and thus increasing anxiety about students returning?
Wow. Well, first of all, shout out to Tammy. So good to see you on the webinar today. Thanks for being here from Florida. So I'll give a very brief introduction to this, and I'd really like our panelists to respond to that one. That is something that messaging has been so challenging in this. And I think part of it is because people's just anxiety is so much heightened during this period. And we want to, of course, start off with being sensitive. I will tell you, I've seen a couple of things that have come out on the positive and negative. I've seen a couple of colleges and universities in their responses to what are you doing this fall, lead with saying, our concern is for the safety of everyone in doing this in a safe way. And I think that is a really reassuring way that you're acknowledging that is the first thing you're concerned about. And I will call out, this morning on ABC, there was an interview with a college president, a university president, who didn't lead with that. And it really came off as being as if he hadn't thought about the safety of students. And the reporter kept going after it because of that. So I think, in my mind, I think if we're not leading with acknowledgement that safety and health is our primary concern, I think we're missing the message. I think we can't inadvertently appear to be tone deaf. What are other panelists think of that?
Well, I would say, Tom, that I absolutely agree with that. Putting students first is a very positive way of expressing community. I think I would follow up by talking about full transparency. Some of the things that I've seen from presidents and from others speaks to the notion of being pretty open about we're in new territory and we're not exactly sure what's coming. We're going to keep you informed, and when we know, you'll know. That kind of approach, I think, is good. And the third thing that I would comment, in addition to the idea of students first and transparency, the third thing would be to communicate that what we're going to be doing will be guided by science and what the health professionals are telling us we need to do, which is another way of reinforcing the fact that students, staff, and faculty are all important. I think that's a really very good approach for colleges and universities to do. One other thing that comes to mind, and something that I saw in a survey that was done of high school counselors, they said they wanted to hear from the people that they interacted with, not the university president. I thought that was a very interesting point because a lot of university presidents tend to take the stage and make the pronouncements, but others who are in staff positions should be communicating both with students, parents, high school counselors as well, because that's a way of communicating. Students are important, a way of communicating the whole university is about doing what's right and making sure that we're being transparent about what's going on. And you'll also see commonalities and consistency in the messaging, which I think is great.
All right, thank you, Stan. I'm going to ask for one final question, and I'm going to ask for Jody to be the first respondent, regardless of the topic. I want to make sure we've gotten a chance for everyone to get in here on an answer. What's our last question, Melanie?
Great. The last question is a great one from Gina McNeil. What aspects, if any, of your institution's response to the pandemic would you like to continue in the new normal? Are there things that you've discovered in this process that should persist post-pandemic?
Great question. And I think what I would add here is the incredible generosity that I'm seeing from folks at institutions towards their students. And it's not that we weren't generous before, but we've opened up a whole new avenue of generosity, and that comes in the form of flexibility around deadlines, being fair about processes, really asking ourselves, did we put up those barriers? Are they necessary? Can we find other ways to deal with those for our students? And I think generosity around financial support that many institutions are now attempting to do. So I think that, I hope, continues beyond. And as I said, it's not that we weren't generous before, but I think we've really looked at how we do things so much differently now and have said, those are barriers, let's remove them. And I think we've done that certainly with an eye to being far more committed to equity and diversity and inclusion for our students.
Excellent. Thank you, Jody. I'm going to ask our panel for one last bit of advice. What's the one piece of advice you might want to give to people as we wrap this up? And Kimberly, I'm going to ask you to please start.
Wonderful. Thank you. And thank you for this opportunity to share. This is certainly a big day, May 1, but I'm glad I was able to take a few moments out to share what's happening here at Mary Washington. So my bit of advice would be to really find healthy ways to offload emotion and stress. This is certainly a very stressful time, much more so than usual. And so I think it's very important that as enrollment managers, we find ways to offload the emotion and the stress, whether that be running, which I find to be very, very relaxing, whatever that is for you. I just encourage everyone to really take the time to find healthy ways, again, to offload the emotion and also, of course, the stress.
Thank you, Kimberly. Stan.
I give a shout out to all of the folks who joined the coffee break. Thank you so much for everything that you're doing for all of your students. My advice would be, one, adapts, but do it strategically, not by chasing squirrels.
Great. Thank you, Stan. Jody.
And I too want to shout out to all of you for the effort that you've put in over the last few weeks. It's been amazing to watch all of the work that you've done in such a short period of time. And I would add that continue to draw upon your shared governance structure for decision making. It really creates opportunities for more transparency. It builds trust across the institution, and it really strengthens the leadership across the whole college or university.
Excellent. Thank you, Jody. And I'll add my own last piece of advice, which is remember that at this time, people need lots of reassurance. Reassure them of the things you already are doing very well. Students really want to know that they're coming to quality academic programs, that the school is affordable, and that there are ways to help students afford this educational experience. And they want to know that they're going to have an opportunity for a great career after that college experience. So don't forget to communicate those things and just reassure your students that you're there, you're still doing the great things that you've been doing all along. I just want to thank my fellow panelists and turn it back over to Melanie.
Thank you so much, Tom. And thank you to all of our panelists for a really excellent discussion today. For those of you who need much more specific and targeted guidance, Acro Consulting has marshaled expertise to offer heavily discounted express consulting sessions priced at $9.95 to support your unique challenges with seasoned expertise and actionable recommendations. For more information, please contact consulting@acro.org. I hope that we'll see you at an upcoming topic. We have several coffee breaks scheduled for the next week. Next week on Tuesday, May 5th, we'll be talking with Acro Board of Directors to discuss the search for an executive director. Come and hear about the search process and give your feedback in terms of what you think Acro needs in its next executive director. Additionally, on Wednesday, May 6th, we have the third webinar in a three-part series. This one is DIY transcript and document solutions on sustaining business continuity during challenging times with the Acro Speedy Committee. And on Friday, May 8th, we have colleagues from the NCAA, NJCAA, and NAIA to talk about athletics eligibility in this times of crisis. For more information and registration, visit acro.org/COVID guidance. We hope to see you again next week. Happy Friday and have a wonderful weekend.